Rupert Beale. I'd like to ask the panel a question about the nature of religious belief, and just to borrow a metaphor from my own field, which is medicine. If somebody comes into the hospital with terrible pain in their chest, they might or might not be having a heart attack, and I can do various tests to try and determine how likely it is that they really are having a heart attack. And there's often a great deal of uncertainty. But I have to make a decision about whether or not to give them an aspirin. Do the panel think it's more like whether or not the patient's had a heart attack, or whether or not I ought to give the patient an aspirin?
When I had to choose a motto a little while ago, I chose a motto from 1 Thessalonians 5:21, which says, "Test everything, hold fast what is good." And I think that's the approach I would like to take to my religion, and of course, obviously, to my science and all the things that lie in between.
It might not be easy to do this in the context described in the emergency room with the patient with the heart attack.
Test everything. I don't think test everything means do every test.
Your book provides splendid empirical evidence, if more were needed, that it's perfectly possible for those with a belief in God to be well-informed scientists and vice versa. I was wondering if you could say how the dialogue has given fruitful outcomes. Are there ways in which the insights from science make a difference to the way one thinks about one's belief in God? And vice versa, are there ways that the belief in God has changed or influenced the approach to science?
Well, I think the example of evolution really has changed the way we think about the problem of evil and the problem of free will. There's always been the so-called free will defense to the problem of evil. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear that there is and needs to be a free process defense as well. Or to put it in a more positive way, you know, just beginning to understand the extraordinary orderliness that comes out of disorder, but the autonomy that exists in creation, even though it's very dependent, is a remarkable theological insight. I'm very fortunate to work with Martin Novak, who has the program for evolutionary dynamics at Harvard. And so all the time, you're making little evolutionary models. And it's fascinating what the perspective that gives you. And you realize how you can sort of tweak the evolutionary process in a computer. But on the other hand, you can put a lot of tweaks in, but it will still come out eventually the same way. There's this curious interplay between chance and necessity, to use a rather outmoded slogan, which is immensely fruitful. And I think that the implications of that, Martin's been working with Sarah Coakley, for example, a lot on this. The evolution of altruism, the extraordinary role that cooperation plays in the whole of biology. So those are, that's a way in which I think science has greatly informed theology.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's unquestionable that theological thought about the nature of creation has been different in the last 150 years than it was before that. I mean, no scientist, in my view, has so widely influenced general public thinking as Charles Darwin. Theology doesn't affect science in a direct way, it seems to me, or religious reflection. When I was in parish life, people used sweetly to say to me sometimes, "Did your Christian belief help you with your science?" And I had to say, no, it didn't. And I certainly, reading my colleagues' papers, couldn't tell their belief or unbelief from the way they did theoretical particle physics. What I think theology can do is set scientific insight within a broader and a deeper context of understanding. In my view, of course atheism isn't stupid, but I think that theism does explain more than atheism does, so that the wonderful order of the world and so on are not just happy accidents about the world, they become intelligible themselves if they are seen as reflections of the mind of a creator. I mean, particularly at the level of fundamental physics, science studies the world, it does seem shot through with signs of mind in its rational order and rational beauty and beautiful equations and so on. And it doesn't seem unreasonable to ask whether that might not be because there is some capital M divine mind behind it. So there's those sort of relationships, I think.
Perhaps I could just mention that, in fact, in the Faraday Institute, we have a current research project being carried out by a historian on the historical relationship between religious belief and scientific creativity, looking way back 1600. And I think often these sort of links are much easier seen with the benefit of hindsight, or interpreted with the benefit of hindsight, than in contemporary science, where things are happening right now. So, but looking back and looking at people's letters and their diaries and all that kind of thing, I think is a fascinating exercise historically. And we've been extremely interested to see some of the interesting crossovers between sometimes religious beliefs and the content of scientific theories, not just as a motivation for doing science, but actually, we think, actually influencing the content of theories. There is actually one interesting example from Charles Darwin himself. In his, as we all know, he was so impressed by reading Paley at Cambridge and memorized it and so forth. And there's a very prescient paragraph actually in Paley, which is often not picked up by people, where in fact he does summarize natural selection. It's not called that. He discards it. He says that he couldn't imagine that number of animals and so forth dying and becoming extinct. But it's interesting that it's right there. When you come to Origin of Species itself, I mean, many historians have called it the last great work of Victorian natural theology. And I think there's something in that, especially when you read the wonderful last paragraph, but the way it's shaped, the way it's thought about, and the way, in a sense, he's bringing Palean order, the whole sense of order, and trying to get biology into order. And of course it's evolutionary biology which has brought coherence into biology. And I think one can detect there a sort of feed through from the world of natural theology into shaping some of the ways he thought about the application of scientific laws to biology.
I think, if I may just add, the only instance I can think of in the last 100 years where some form of religious prejudice clearly has slowed up the advance in science was the great reluctance amongst cosmologists, or certain cosmologists, to accept the idea of Big Bang because it looked a little bit too much like creation. And it was unfortunate, perhaps in that context, that it happened to be a Roman Catholic priest that came up with the equations. And of course, you can't help feeling that if Mendel hadn't been an Austrian abbot, then the very anti-religious German Darwinists would have taken him more seriously, although whether his worst crime was to be Austrian or an abbot for the Germans is debatable. I think we do have to be careful. There are, in some sections of academe, there is this feeling that because, religion is supposed to be a delusion, there's certainly a feeling amongst some scientists and philosophers that it's not a great idea for them to go too public on their faith in case they get some form of discrimination against. I hope that's untrue, but I think it is terribly important. Apparently wacky ideas in science can often turn out to be right. Historically, religious people have done a lot of good science and still do so, and there mustn't be religious prejudice either way in the scientific community.